Here in this council, 1,000 days into Putin's full-scale invasion, the UK is keeping the spotlight on Ukraine, not just for the security of the Ukrainian people or just for Europe's security, but for something much more fundamental, which every UN member should care about: the right to be a sovereign, independent country, free to choose its future, protect its borders, and stand up to aggression. Everyone on this council should be familiar from the climate crisis with the concept of tipping points, the critical moment after which changes are irreversible. These exist in geopolitics as they do in science. And unless Putin fails, I believe we face one over Ukraine. Unless Putin fails, we could plunge into a world where the principles enshrined in the UN Charter will have lost their meaning. Unless Putin fails, others will be inspired to wage imperialist wars of conquest. Unless Putin fails, our faith in international law may never return. And unless Putin fails, each of our borders will be less safe. If anyone doubted Putin's intent this weekend's massive missile attack on Ukraine and its energy infrastructure should serve as a reminder. Putin wants to plunge Ukraine into darkness. For years, the Kremlin has tried to bully Ukraine into submission. Russian missiles have struck hospitals and grain ships destined for Africa. Russian troops have raped and tortured Ukrainian prisoners, and Russian police have abducted Ukrainian children for indoctrination in Russia. Like a desperate gambler, Putin has got all in on this illegal war. Putin has lost so many soldiers, 1,000 days into a war he thought he would win in days. He's now turning to North Korea for reinforcements and to Iran for ballistic missiles. These actions must be met with a firm response, and that's why today I can announce fresh sanctions on Iran Air and Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines, a direct response to Iran's ballistic missile deliveries to Russia. We are using the full force of our sanctions to constrain the Kremlin's illegal actions, from their shadow fleet of oil tankers to suppliers to their war machine, from shady kleptocrats to mercenaries destabilizing the continent of Africa. And we are stepping up our support to put Putin in a position of strength with a new loan backed by profits from sanctioned Russian assets, part of a new G7 package of $50 billion in assistance, and a commitment to £3 billion in military aid for as long as it takes. Let me be crystal clear. There is no equivalence, no comparison, no parallel between those reckless states who support Russia's illegal aggression and those who stand with Ukraine in defense of its sovereignty. Council, the Kremlin wants to plunge Ukraine into darkness, but we must stand for the light of its freedom. Ukraine and its partners want peace in line with the UN Charter that brings us together today. But we know that Putin only responds to strength. To have a lasting peace, lasting security, we've got to stand as strong, as united, as patient, as determined as the Ukrainian people. And so I say that my message to Vladimir Putin is simple. We will never let up on countering Russian aggression at every turn. 1,000 days in, we stand for Ukraine. 1,000 days in, we still stand for international order. 1,000 days in, we still stand for the principles which the United Nations was founded upon. And 1,000 days in, we're ready to face down your aggression as the day you started this senseless war. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr.
So David Lammy making his comments as the presiding officer at the Security Council. Tonight is the UK that has the rotating presidency of the Security Council. Mikey Kay and Neda Tawfiq with me. Neda is in New York watching along with us. It was a very vivid picture, I thought, that the previous speaker gave us of the situation in Ukraine, the deaths, the trauma, the generation of Ukrainians deprived of education, an area mined in Ukraine 4 times the size of Switzerland, she said. So 1,000 days in, the toll that this is taking on Ukraine, truly immense.
And she made the point that this has been some of the toughest months yet of the war, saying that 12,164 civilians had been killed, over 600 children, 4 million internally displaced. And you look at the attacks over the weekend in Sumy and Odessa, and she talks about just the scale of the drone strikes and the missile strikes there, and just how it's targeting the energy infrastructure as the winter approaches. So Rosemary DiCarlo really trying to emphasize to the Council just how much worse things have become and how much worse yet they could be in Ukraine. It's really interesting also, Christian, the Security Council held a dedicated meeting to speak about the fact that North Korean troops, the accusations that Russia has been using North Korean troops to start fighting in the Kursk region. And what Rosemary DiCarlo said there was that that would be adding fuel to the fire, that it would be internationalizing this explosive conflict. And as I say, the Security Council did have a dedicated meeting on that issue, and what was really notable was while you had the US and the UK saying that there was about 10,000 North Koreans being disguised as kind of ethnic minority Russians and given ID cards and Russian uniforms, what was interesting was also to hear from South Korea and Japan and their concerns that the fact that Kim Jong-un would most likely be expecting a big payoff from President Putin for the contribution of those troops, and then wondering how that would affect the nuclear profile and the non-proliferation regime worldwide. Yeah. So we can already see this. The
sort of global implications,
the global
implications that David Lammy was talking about. Just a line of breaking news from the Ukrainian foreign minister, who's been talking about the decision Joe Biden took, Mikey, on those long-range missiles, a game changer, he says, for Ukraine. I mean, no weapon or decision like this is in itself going to change the battlefield, but I guess what they can change in aggregate over a period of time is the attrition on the Russian forces, the sort of decisions logistically the Russians are making. So maybe even in 2 months through the winter, maybe it is a game changer for Ukraine.
Over 650,000 Russian soldiers wounded or killed. That's massive. But I think if you look out to what the strategy is now, we talked about Zelensky's victory plan. Trump's going to come in on January the 20th, and the entire world knows that he wants to sit down and negotiate under certain terms. Those terms are likely to be favourable with what Putin's end state is going to be, which is redefining sovereign boundaries inside Donetsk and also preventing Ukraine from getting accession to NATO. So if this strategy allows Zelensky to use ATACMS to degrade and deter Russian and North Korean forces around Kursk, that allows Zelensky to hold on to that territory inside Russia, then maybe when it comes to January the 20th and everyone has to sit down at the table, Zelensky has a little bit more leverage when it comes to negotiating those terms. And I think that's what it's about.
There has been this criticism that Joe Biden, who is a lame duck president after all, has taken a decision which has in some respects tied the hands of Donald Trump, the incoming president. But could you look at it another way and say in actual fact it strengthens his hand, because he's able to say to Putin, look, either you come to the table or we continue supplying these longer range missiles and that will be more painful for you?
I think it absolutely does have the possibility of making Trump look even more of a saviour, because if this now turns to a a change of nuclear doctrine, which it is from Putin, who said that aggression against Russia by a non-nuclear state, but with the support of a nuclear state, is proposed to be considered as their joint attack on Russia, and he's now changing nuclear doctrine to include potential responses to an attack that poses a threat to Russian sovereignty. Then absolutely, you know, if Trump then comes in and then decompresses this whole rhetoric, it could actually make him look, you know, like the savior.